The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Module 3 in the Peak Services Lunch and Learn series. Welcome wherever you are throughout Queensland. I just want to check, first of all, that I'm being heard. So could I ask you please to type it in the question box, just a word like clear or something like that. That just lets me know that I'm being heard. That would be great. Great. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Catherine. Okay. Thanks, Bevan. Thanks, Stan. Okay. Sounds like I'm coming through loud and clear. They're still coming through, which is fantastic. Okay. So let's get underway. And um, as I always do at the end of this, you'll receive a copy of the presentation and you'll also receive the slides. And so that'll be sometime this afternoon, so you can review them and just relax and enjoy yourself at the moment. At least we know that it's the same time all throughout Queensland today. So this afternoon, of course, you'll receive those. Okay, sound's gone off, says somebody. Okay, well, I'm not doing anything from this end. I just have to hope and pray it comes back, I guess. Not much I can do. I've touched nothing. So, Kath, audio is breaking up. Okay, so obviously we've got a few issues. Okay, look, I might just plow on and just hope that things come good. Thanks, Emma, for your comment, and see how we go. I've got a good connection here, or what I thought was. So, anyway, what else can we do? So I'll just plow on. Okay. All right. So the Lunch and Learn series, of course, we are up to Module 3, and you'll notice, of course, we've done the first 2. And you can see, of course, that in the very first session, we looked at the whole concept of feedback. So I'm hoping you're still doing that. I'm hoping that you're finding good opportunities where you can give feedback to other people. I'm hoping you can find that space to do that and are continuing to do it. And of course, last fortnight, we looked at influencing capabilities. So the whole purpose of that was to get you to complete the influencing capability diagnostic online. And of course, I debriefed you on that in the last session. And the whole purpose of that was to give you an opportunity to be able to practice your skills. Okay, just checking now. Is the sound any better, guys? Because obviously I'm just talking here. Okay, let's have a look and see what people are saying. Sound on and off. Audio breaking up. Sound. Okay, someone's saying clear. All right, dropping in and out. Yes, it's a bit better. All right, I'm starting to get a bit more positive. Thanks, Judy. Anybody else? Okay, it must be getting better, maybe. Anyway, unfortunately with this sort of stuff, there's not much I can do. I mean, there's all sorts of internet connections all over the place, and in some places it's going well and not. Anyway, so we've got 3 more modules to go after this, and of course, each time you're given some homework to do. So let's launch into today's session and what we're going to be covering. And before I do that, I just want to make what I believe to be a very important point, and that is this. It's your primary role as a leader is to get the very best out of each team member that you lead. Now, there's a lot of different roles of being a leader, of course, but I would suggest to you that this is one of your primary roles. Maybe not the only one, but it's certainly up there with one of them. And you might say to me, well, I've got somebody that works for me that I would rate out of 10, like a 2 out of 10 in terms of their efficiency and effectiveness, which obviously isn't very good. How can I possibly get them to a 10? Well, you know what? You can't. the best you can do perhaps is get them from a 2 to a 3, or maybe even a 4 if you're lucky. So what you're aiming to do is to get small incremental improvements in the team that you lead. And if you do that, what you'll find is that you will obviously exponentially get a great deal of traction. So just small bite-sized changes is what we're looking for. All right. So getting that person, if you're thinking about getting them from a 2 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10, well, firstly, it's probably unrealistic. Therefore, it's not likely to happen, and that might sort of get you a little bit demotivated, and then you might decide not to attempt to do some of the things we suggest. So, it's small incremental changes, as I say. Now, there are 3 key things I'd want to get out of today's session. I want to talk about some of the barriers to conversations. And reason I'm going to talk about barriers to conversations is that really what this session's about is to have better, more effective and efficient conversations with the people that you lead. Because as I said, I think it was last module, you're dealing with a bunch of people. An organization is simply, or a team is simply a bunch of people all working towards a common cause. And at the end of the day, people are people, so we do need to converse with them. So your working relationship with the people you lead is critically important. Okay? Then we're going to talk about the 5 conversations framework, and I dare say some of you who are familiar with my work would already know what that entails, but it's a framework that'll help you to have these very important developmental conversations on a regular basis with the team that you lead. I want to share with you 5 new or additional conversations or developmental conversations that you can have as well. So by the end of today's webinar, we'll have 10 conversations that are brief and effective that you can put into your kit bag in terms of having conversations with people. Now, by conversations, of course, I'm not sitting around idly talking about chit-chat and shooting the breeze about a bunch of things. Not really talking about that. I'm really talking about developing and connecting with the people that you lead as a means of assisting them to become a better version of themselves. In other words, to improve their own performance. So this is not a performance review in disguise. This is, as you see, it'll be a series of conversations that you can have that are performance focused, or more importantly, development focused. Okay, so moving on, what I want to share with you now is some very sobering statistics. And I do want to set the scene here, because if I'm working on the premise that we need to be having more conversations with people, then perhaps we better find out what people are actually saying about conversations. Perhaps we should find out what people are saying about their manager and communication in general. So here's the first sobering statistic, and I can assure you it goes downhill from here, and then we'll obviously pick things up from there. 79% of organisations worldwide struggle to engage and retain their employees. 79%. Now, depending on where you are in Queensland and your geographical location, you'll either find it very easy or not so easy to attract good people. And I realise this is a serious issue for some organisations, but there are other issues as well. You don't want to make them any worse. Obviously, if people aren't happy in terms of their working relationship with their boss, then they may start to be looking at what they might perceive to be greener pastures. But 79% of people are having trouble keeping their good people. I often say that the only rats that leave a sinking ship are the ones that can swim. And what I mean by that is that the capable ones will often leave, and the ones that you perhaps would like to leave actually end up staying. And that's a truism, isn't it, in local government or anywhere else. Second key point is that 86% of organisations believe that they don't have an adequate leadership pipeline to address these problems. So what that basically means is that not only do we have a problem, we don't have the leadership capabilities to be able to deal with that problem. So I think in some cases this is quite true of local government, and leadership development is a really important plank in the development of local government, and I think it's true right across all industries, in fact. The next telling statistic is that 90% of leaders rely on their own ideas rather than seeking the involvement from their team. Worse still, 98% of leaders fail to listen or respond to interpersonal cues from those they've interacted with. So this is what employees are saying. They're saying that they feel that their leaders are not being as collaborative and interactive as they probably could. This isn't in local government. This is surveys right across 21 industries. But basically, they're pretty damning statistics that are showing us that people believe that they should be more engaged and involved in the day-to-day running of the organisation. Disturbingly, only 5% of leaders are effective at building trust in their interactions with their team members. Now, that's pretty disturbing, isn't it? Only 5%. That means that 95% of people do not have the capabilities to build trust with their team members. So, I'd ask you rhetorically, what's your trust level like with your team members? How would you rate it? Is it high? Is it medium? Is it low? Does it fluctuate? Does it go up and down depending on what the circumstances are that you're facing? But your job is to try to keep those trust levels as high as you possibly can. And there's a reason for that, because without trust, you're not going to achieve much in your team. Now, I realise that two people can violate trust. It's not just about you. But in terms of your own behaviour, it's not a good idea for you to violate the trust that the other person has in you, certainly not intentionally at least. 60% of employees feel their self-esteem dented by their leaders at work. These people would rather do almost anything else than sit through a performance conversation with their boss. Although, significantly, they did acknowledge that a good boss with excellent interaction skills could enhance their productivity by as much as 60%. So people are basically saying that people are hopeless at having the performance conversation, but if someone was good at it, it would make all the difference in the world. Isn't that interesting? So people are expecting to have these performance conversations. People are expecting you to have these developmental conversations. And in fact, if you don't, it only makes things worse. 79% of employees who quit their jobs cite a lack of appreciation as the key reason for leaving, which is pretty significant, isn't it? So often they won't say this in their exit interview to their HR manager, but a lot of people yearn for appreciation and recognition, and often if they don't get it, they'll go elsewhere. You might argue, well, I'll give it to them if they deserve it, and maybe they don't deserve it. But at the very least, if we've got this turnover issue where people are leaving because of appreciation, it does explain some real issues for managers, doesn't it? 65% of North Americans report that they don't receive any recognition in the previous year. Wow. Now, of course, you could, what constitutes recognition can vary depending on the person. That's true. But the very fact that we've got 65% of people saying that they didn't receive any in the last 12 months probably suggests that there needs to be more. That's probably fairly important. And that's why I suggested to you that giving positive feedback 3 times a day is good, just to balance up the ledger, so there's not always every time they hear from you it's negative, which is obviously not good. All right, now let's talk about conversations, because first of all, if you've got any questions, please type them in the question box, because I'm happy to answer any at this stage. But let me now, while you're perhaps thinking about that, let me now talk about conversations. Because I think when you talk about the word conversations, people will often think around sitting down, wasting time, chit-chatting, shooting the breeze. And I think that it's easy to think that conversations aren't actually very productive. But done right, of course, they're very, very productive. So the first thing I would say about conversations is that organisations are conversations. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if organisations are a bunch of people working towards a common cause, then every day inside your organisation, there are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, depending on the size of your organisation, or even hundreds of thousands of conversations going on. Some of them are short, some of them are long, some of them are boring, some of them are interesting, some of them are work-related, some of them are not, some of them are relationship building, some of them are task relationships, some of them are done, spontaneously. Some of these are done in a very organised and systematic way, such as a meeting. So if you think about it, organisations are conversations, and perhaps more accurately, we could say that organisations are a series of conversations. And so really, I think the issue for you and me is this next point, which will come up now and gone, and there it is again, is that good quality conversation is perhaps sadly lacking. I'd be interested to hear your point of view about this, but my feeling is that we're relying so much these days on technology, and a good thing too, because obviously it does a lot of good things. But what it does is we're perhaps relying on it too much when a simple face-to-face conversation could suffice. And I think what that means is that we are starting to lose the impact of having those conversations. So I'd be keen to hear what you thought about that. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not suggesting we throw all our technology out and be talking to people around a campfire. I'm really just simply saying that I think sometimes we send emails when we could be having conversations, or we send a text when we probably should be sitting down having a conversation, or we send an email when we could be making a phone call, and so forth. So we often hear people say that, there's an art to conversation. They actually say, in fact, they use the title, The Art of Conversation. It's quite overused. I personally don't think there is any art to it, which might sound a little bit controversial. What it simply means is, and I've just got a question here, so I better respond to that immediately. How do you stop a conversation ending in disagreement? Well, look, that's a good question, Catherine. I think what you need to do is, at the very least, agree to disagree, and you just agree to disagree. I mean, or leave the door open for another conversation. So what you might do is say to the other person, look, clearly you've got a perspective and I've got to respect that, and I've got a different perspective and I'm hoping you can respect that. How about we take some time out, and how about we reconvene again next week, same time, and let's just let a little bit of water under the bridge and just see where we stand in relation to our own particular views. That's not a bad outcome, and let's face it, in a lot of cases you will have to agree to disagree, because that's the reality of it. Conversations should not end in an explosive disagreement. So I'm hoping, I'm sure Catherine, I'm sure you're talking about situations where it's really important that you do agree. I'm sure that is the case. But at the end of the day, you can't magically make them agree. And you might go back to your influencing capabilities profile, and you might ask yourself a very important question. What's my influencing profile? And what might the other person's influencing profile be? And could I perhaps position what I'm trying to suggest to them in a different way so that they might be interested? So have a crack at that, and then come back and tell me how you go. But look, at the end of the day, if people disagree with you or you disagree with other people, that's just life. I'm afraid there is absolutely very little you can do until either you've changed your point of view or they've changed theirs. Of course, you've got compromise to try and look at, maybe the next meeting. But often if you leave a little bit of time, it gives people a chance to absorb the arguments of the other side and perhaps look at things with fresh eyes and a new approach. Thanks for the question. It's a good question. So look, coming back to the art of conversation, no, there's no art form. At the end of the day, we all have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of conversations all the time. So we're practicing all the time. There are some conversations that require a little bit more work, of course, which are those difficult performance conversations. I think they do have some skill sets that are advanced, I have no doubt. But let's face it, the majority of conversations are not onerous and difficult, and particularly the conversations that I'm going to share with you today. So I guess it beggars the question, have we actually lost the need for conversations? And, I know many of you are in rural areas, and there's a few of you in the city, and I'd ask you the question, if you had to go home tonight on a bus or a train or something, those of you in the sort of city precincts, try something. Just actually look up from your iPhone or iPad or whatever it is you've got and have a look around, and you'll be amazed. Everyone will have their head buried in a screen. And I dare say that when they get home that night, they'll have their head buried in another screen, which is called a television, all the while perhaps making Facebook updates on another screen. So our whole life is revolving around a series of screens now, and I just wonder whether we've lost the need for conversations. I don't believe we've lost the need for conversations. I think perhaps we're having conversations in different ways, and I think somehow some of those different ways are less effective than the good old-fashioned face-to-face conversation. That'd be my take on it anyway, but I'd be interested in your thoughts. I was talking to somebody in local government a couple of weeks ago, and they made an interesting comment. They said to me that, oh, I don't have time for conversations, or we don't have time for conversations. What they were arguing, of course, is they were basing it on two premises. They were saying, on the one hand, that conversations, of course, aren't terribly productive, so therefore we don't find the time for them. And secondly, that conversations can often take a lot of time. In both cases, they're erroneous. Conversations can be very effective, and they don't have to take a long time. And of course, that's why this manager, senior officer in local government, said we don't have time for conversations, because he was assuming that they were negative, well, they weren't effective, and also they took a long time. Now, two authors that I enjoy very much, colleagues of mine, Jim Kuzner and Barry Posner, wrote a very interesting book called Credibility, amongst other books. And in their book on credibility, they make the statement that leadership is a relationship, which I think is a very interesting statement. Leadership is a relationship. So if we argue that leadership is a relationship, in other words, if people aren't in some sort of working, trusting relationship with you in the workplace, then it's virtually impossible to lead them. I think that's very true. I'm sure you do too. Of course, it takes two to tango in terms of how you have that particular working relationship. But my argument to Kuzner and Posner is simply this: how do you have a relationship? And the answer, of course, is one conversation at a time. There is no other way to have a relationship with anybody other than to have one conversation at a time. That's how we build trust. That's how we build rapport. That's how we build engagement, one conversation at a time. So you really can't avoid it. And I just wanted to hit home on that point that you just can't avoid the whole notion of having conversations. So, guys, if you've got questions or comments or observations about any of that, go for your life. I'm all ears. Let's move on to the next area while you're thinking about that. I'm going to share with you 9 common barriers to communication. Now, these 9 barriers, in my view, are getting in the way of you having good conversations in your local government environment. Now, they're not all specific to local government. In fact, many of them are very generic and would fit into any industry at all. They're not necessarily in any order, but they're certainly important, all of them. So, what's the first barrier? Well, I think one of the key barriers, which is a personal barrier, is that we often don't pay attention when we're having conversations. So what happens is that we often, under the guise of multitasking, will tap out an email while somebody is at the door wanting to talk to us. So what we say while we're tapping out the email is, just keep talking. I'm listening to you. Just got to finish this email. Unfortunately, we're not actually being effective in terms of the email, nor are we being effective in terms of the exchange with the person at the door. The email is probably not as clearly thought out as it could be, and the person at the door is well aware that the email is more important to them, that's the manager, than it is to them, to the person at the door, which isn't very good when the person wants to talk to you about something fairly serious. So my suggestion to you is close the laptop or whatever you're working on, or if you can't, because you clearly do have to get that email out, then you simply assertively say to the other person, I have to finish this email because I don't want to lose my train of thought. As soon as I've done this, what I'll do is I'll come over and have a chat to you about your issue, or words to that effect. That's the right way to do it. So don't think for a minute that this idea of multitasking works. The research shows conclusively that we are not capable of doing 2 or more things at the same time, despite all the jokes we have about males and females and all the rest. The truth of the matter is we're not good at it. And so therefore the best thing that you can do is one thing at a time and do it really well, and then get on to the next thing. All right. What about the second barrier? The second barrier is restricted information channels. I hear this a lot in local government, people saying to me, you'll get told on a need-to-know basis, or no news is good news. People are basically saying that we'll be very selective, that is, management will be very selective about what we tell you. So you can make assumptions that if we don't tell you, it's all good, which, clearly I don't think is good enough, because what we're expecting, of course, is that people will be able to have the same perspective as their leader. It can't be done if they don't know what's going on. I think even to the point where you don't know the answer to something, it's probably a good idea. Say council's made a decision, you're not quite sure what the implications of it are, and your team are haranguing you about that, and give us the answers. What is the council trying to do? And you really don't have the answers to that. You're probably best just to say to people, I don't have the answer to that, and what I'll do is I'll check it out, and the moment I have something for you, I'll let you know. All right, so to me, that's the way to handle it. So that's, if you say nothing, then the assumption often can be that you know more than you're really letting on. And of course, what happens is trust level starts to dissipate if people think that you're withholding information that you could share for other people. Now, we all know about the Courier Mail test. We all know that certain things can end up on the front page of the Courier Mail. But at the end of the day, containing information and restricting it, I can assure you, isn't necessarily going to stop the Courier Mail test. The truth of the matter is there will be rumours and innuendos and false information peddled about a range of things, and it's worse if it's false and based on innuendo that's incorrect. So let people know what's going on. Let your team know as much as you possibly can about what's going on. It's really important, I think. Another restriction or a barrier to having good conversations in your workplace is the whole notion of not giving regular feedback. Now, we've obviously done a whole unit, a module on this in the first one, but I would suggest to you that we need to be doing more and more of this. And the feedback is not just negative, it's also positive. And I believe that you can certainly make a difference in terms of doing this effectively. So think carefully about giving more feedback to the people that you lead. You will be pleasantly surprised at what it does for them and for you, for that matter, and for the rest of the organisation. I found a very amusing, I've got to tell you, a very amusing, well, it's sort of a sad story really, but it's amusing. I was in work, I'll remain nameless, but I was in a local government organisation. I won't even say where it is. I don't want this to be, anyway, I'll tell you the story. And we had somebody who just commenced work there in this local government organisation. And they'd been there for 9 months. And they're only young, and this was their first job, in fact. And I said to them innocently, "How have you settled in?" And she said to me, "I don't know." I said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And she said, "Well, I haven't had any feedback." I said, "What about your probation?" And she said, "I haven't had any feedback at all. I have no idea." I said, "Wow." I said, "How do you feel about that?" And she said, "Well, I'd like to know what I'm doing. I'd like to know whether I'm doing things well or not. I second guess myself and so forth." And I said, would you like me to go and talk to your manager? Perhaps I can arrange for, and it was a him, perhaps I can arrange for him to sit down with you and give you some feedback. And she said, oh, her face started beaming. She said, "Oh, that'd be fantastic. Thanks, Tim. I'd really appreciate that." So I went into the manager's, I was actually outside them. It was this outside the manager's office. I knocked on the door and I came in. He said, and he looked over his half moon glasses at me and he said, "Look, what's up, Tim?" And I said, "Well, let's call her Mary. Mary started 9 months ago." And she said, "Oh," he said, "Oh, yeah, yeah, Mary, yep, I remember, yep." And I said, "She's really keen to get some feedback. Do you think you could give her some feedback?" And he looked at me and he said, over his half moon glasses, and he said, "Oh, no, I couldn't do that." And I thought, wow, what's going on? How could you possibly not be giving feedback to someone that's been there for 9 months? And I thought to myself, maybe they're having, heaven forbid for me to raise this now in the current political climate, but are they having an affair? Is there some conflict of interest? Is there something I don't know about? Anyway, he looked at me very earnestly and he said, if I have to give feedback to Mary, I'm going to have to give feedback to everyone in my team. And of course, I was rendered speechless because I thought, my goodness, that's exactly what your job should be. So anyway, give people feedback. It's really important, of course. Number 4, a culture of not asking questions. Now, I reckon nearly every one of you in this Lunch and Learn series has got a good technical background. In other words, you've either learned a trade or you've got a university qualification. And because you've got a trade or a qualification, it's probably that you've learned how to answer questions. So people pose problems to you. So if you're an engineer, you come up with a solution. If you're an accountant, you come up with a solution. If you're in the outdoor working area, you come up with a solution. The problem with that, of course, is that when you're leading people and trying to get the very best out of people, your job is actually to ask them questions, not to answer them. Now, that's hard to do because the truth is that you've all been brought up on the notion of answering questions. You go around to Grandma's house and you're on the porch and Grandma asks you a polite question and you don't answer because you're off daydreaming somewhere. You get a clip behind the ear and Mum and Dad say to you, always answer Grandma when she asks you a question. And you get to school and you're staring out the window and the teacher asks you a question and you get into trouble because you were staring out the window. You get into trouble for not answering questions. And you get in the workplace and you get into trouble for not answering your supervisor's question. So this goes on and on and on. So by the time we've got through our study or our trade or whatever it is, we end up believing that our whole job in life is just to answer questions. But the truth is, if you're going to be good at conversations, you must learn to ask questions. The questions that you ask are why, what, where, who, how, and which. You start any question with any of those words, and you'll get more than a yes or no. And of course, that opens up the possibility to have a conversation. So my suggestion to you is get good at asking questions. It becomes really, really important. Too much formality. So these conversations that I'm suggesting that you do should not be done in your office. Why? Because that's your territory. People don't feel comfortable in your office, surprisingly. It doesn't matter how much you smile or whatever, if you've got an office, that is. But look, don't do it in your office because it's adding a degree of formality and you actually want the other person to contribute to the conversation, and they'll only contribute to the conversation if they believe that they're being, respected and treated with dignity and that they feel comfortable. So don't do it in the office. Now, how much, dare I say, in local government, how much time do you spend each day on email? If you're having trouble answering that, it might be a good idea for you to find out. Now, I can tell you statistically across 21 industries, the average person spends 2 hours a day engaged in email. So that's basically a 10-hour exercise over the course of 5 days, which is quite a chunk of time. But the problem is not so much that we spend 10 hours on email. That's pretty much how we communicate these days. So I'm certainly not anti-email. My problem with email is that we actually probably send emails when we should be having a conversation. So instead of sending an email where you want to get a quick reply, how about you just get out of your chair and go and talk to the person, if indeed that's possible, or get on the mobile phone and ring them. You'll find that the conversation will go better. You'll find that you'll get your response a lot quicker, and everyone will be better for it. Now, email is an asynchronous technology. Now, by asynchronous, what I mean by that is that when you send someone an email asking them a question, they in turn can respond to you when they choose to respond to you. So in other words, it's not like face-to-face where you ask a question and then the other person answers it and goes back and forward like a tennis game where the ball goes over the net. In this case, people can respond when they choose to respond. And now that's problematic because you might be after a quick response and, of course, no one's answered your email for a day, and then you get upset about it because you think it's low priority. And then you find out later the person's off sick or something. But if you just picked up the phone or gone to see them, you could have worked that out very quickly. So email is or can be a barrier to having important conversations. Now, the other thing that's important, and this is a Lunch and Learn series, and you may be in an executive position. You're probably not, but if you are, then you need to start to think for yourself, what sort of conversations do we have at our level, at the top end of the organisation, at the executive leadership team. I can tell you that if your executive leadership team is not having good conversations, open, transparent, robust nevertheless, but good conversations, then that will duplicate right throughout the organisation. That is how it will work. So if someone said to me, I want to create a culture of conversation, where do I start? My comment to them would be go straight for the ELT and start there, because people will model their behaviour based on the executive leadership team. The CEO and the directors will set the scene, and counsellors as well, to a certain extent. So, it's a good place to start at that senior team. Now, barrier number 8, and it's a very real barrier, as we all know, is the fear of emotion. Now, what I mean by the fear of emotion is that sometimes we won't bring up subjects in the workplace because we're afraid of opening what we call a can of worms. Or, another cliche, we'll let sleeping dogs lie. Now, in my view, that's not an adequate enough reason not to talk about it. We have this strange idea that we should be leaving our feelings at home, that we should be completely objective at work, and that we should suck it up. So we have all of these very strange sort of views about ourselves as human beings, and in the same breath we'll argue that we don't like this idea of artificial intelligence taking over our jobs. And yet what we're doing is becoming more and more robotic. So you can see the interesting irony there. So the other thing about emotion, of course, is that when you have a conversation with someone, you're worried about how they might react. That's not your concern. Your concern is to communicate it as professionally as you probably can, and they will react however they choose to react. That's their decision. Respect them for that. And you'll find a lot of times that they don't react the way you thought they'd react, because they're a human being. So just do what you need to do, and don't allow emotion to get in the way, because it's just not a good idea. So just allow people to communicate and give them time and space to do that. All right, so don't use the I won't open a can of worms idea for why you shouldn't communicate. And finally, office layout. Now, I believe, I reckon that most of your local government environments will be open plan. So you would have a series of people working in alcoves in an open plan environment. You might have some offices for the senior officers, or even coordinators and middle managers, but probably you work in that sort of arrangement, which is an open office. Now, open office came into play several years ago because people were concerned, because they thought that people wouldn't communicate with each other if they were behind a wall. Now, the problem, of course, with open office environments is people are very reluctant to have conversations in these environments, because their conversation will be shared by another 20 people. So they're very selective about when they should talk to others. And of course, by the time you try and book a meeting room to have a conversation, it's just simply not worth it, and we move on to the next thing. So I think open office environments are quite, can be a problem as far as communication is concerned. Now, what I want to share with you in our last 15 minutes of the broadcast is I want to give you a couple of tools to work with. So I didn't get any questions or comments there, so I'm assuming that that's all clear with everyone. So let's talk about the 5 conversations framework, and I want to share with you 5 conversations now that you could be having that could be very easily administered as of virtually now. So you don't need too much with that. This comes from my book, The End of the Performance Review, and I put this together because I didn't really understand why we were having performance reviews. And this was actually a substitute for performance reviews. Now, I understand in local government, even though people grumble about it, you probably can't get rid of your performance reviews. And maybe if you can, the big question is, what do I replace them with? Well, this was the replacement. And in fact, many organisations all over the world now are using, I'm chuffed to say, my 5 conversations framework. And some organisations are using it to improve the quality of communication or use it as an enabler to ensure that we have a better performance review. So whichever way you can use it, but I would suggest that you use it as an enabler. You'll notice in the column, the first column, there are the months. So you've got 5 months and 5 conversations for each month. So 1 conversation, month 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You'll also notice in the next column, the topic. So the topic is, of course, it's a climate review or a strengths and talents or an opportunities for growth or a learning and development or an innovation and continuous improvement conversation. So there is a method to the organisation of that because I put a lot of thought into where to start and where to progress. So you'll find, if you're interested, deeply interested in this, you can get a copy of my book and please yourself, and you'll get all of the reasoning behind why I've done what I've done. But nevertheless, we start with a climate review conversation. Now, the starting question for that is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? Now, that question will precipitate a response like they might give you a 4 out of 10, or they might give you a 6 out of 10, or they might give you whatever, 5 out of 10. It doesn't really matter what they give you because the next question is why. Why have you rated it a 4, a 6, a 7, a 10? What is it about the job? And then, of course, it's a question of you to listen carefully to that. And then you might follow it up with a question around, well, is there anything that I can do to help you increase your job satisfaction? Which is a great question. And then you move on to morale, and then you move on to communication. So it's a nice, easy conversation to have, and I find many local government organisations spend tens of thousands of dollars, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on engagement surveys and climate review surveys. And what they're attempting to do is they collect all this information, the ELT scrutinise it, it might even go to council, decisions are made and then the thing's shelved. No one gets to see or hear anything that comes out of the deliberations around it. And people get cynical. The next time round we have an engagement survey, the interest level drops off significantly and you end up having to sort of convince people to do it. So why not just do that via conversation? That's what this is doing. So if you have a conversation around that, that's the best thing you can do. In conversation 2, why not talk about what people are good at? Let's talk about their strengths and talents rather than what they're not good at. What an interesting way of looking at things. So what are people's innate talents and how can they be better utilised in their current or future roles? That's the thrust of the conversation. And you can do that in a short space of time. Now, the practicalities might be square pegs in round holes. Maybe it's not possible to allow that person to work on some of the areas that they really enjoy because of the nature of the work they do. But you can make a commitment to your team members that if and when an opportunity arises where we could utilise and harness your skill set, we will do so. So then we have an opportunities for growth, which is essentially the opposite, where we're starting to talk about people's weaknesses and what they can do to improve upon those, and that becomes the conversation. And so if you think about it, in conversation 3 and 4, we've now talked about a whole lot of things. How can we capitalise on your strengths? And how can we also minimise or eliminate your areas for improvement or opportunities for growth or your weaknesses? So therefore, in conversation 4, we have a learning and development conversation. And this is a conversation around how we might capitalize on the learnings from conversation 2 and 3, because inevitably there would be some learnings that come out of that. Now, it's not necessarily about always sending people off to a course. It might be to show somebody how to do something. It might be to mentor them. It might be to coach them. Whatever, it might be giving them some experience working in a project. Whatever it might be, that's where you would have that conversation on learning and development. So there's your training needs analysis already done. And if you document it, it's already documented, it's there. So moving on to the 5th conversation, and the final, is the innovation and continuous improvement conversation. So this conversation is about how we can do things better, smarter, easier, more efficiently, with less mistakes, and so forth. So we have a conversation about how we might make our workforce, our working environment more efficient and effective. Essentially, that's what that conversation's about. So whereas conversation 4 is about the individual, conversation 5 is about the working environment they're in. And I think it's really exciting to think that if your organisation took this on, that just think in the month of March or whenever you started, it was Innovation and Continuous Improvement Month. And in that month, everyone was having a conversation about ways and means of making the organisation more efficient and effective. There'd be a couple of really good ideas that would come out of that. And if they were implemented, by good ideas, I mean they might be very cost effective, easy to implement, simple, but make a big difference. So by implementing those, it would make a huge difference in terms of the working environment. So that's the 5 conversations in a nutshell. I'm conscious of time and we're moving towards the end of our time. I just wanted to share with you 5 additional conversations that you might want to have a think about as well. So you've got a coaching conversation. So I would argue that coaching is really a conversation, or should at least be, where you've got two-way communication going on between two people about something that needs to be done. You may well be a mentor to some of your employees or the people in your organisation, or indeed of other people outside local government. That's a great position to be in. I volunteer every year to be a mentor. It's a wonderful experience. You get a tremendous amount out of it. Not the least, of course, is what the mentee gets out of the whole process. That's a conversation, or a series of conversations. Delegation conversation is around the whole notion of you delegating, a complex task to somebody and working with and through them to work out how that might be implemented. You've got the visioning conversation, which is really about the why of work. So giving people some rationale, some context around why you're asking them to do such and such in such and such a way. And the encouraging conversation is that not everyone that works with you is as bulletproof as you are, and you've got to accept the fact that people do respond well and do like genuine encouragement. So how about having a conversation every now and again about that with the people that you lead? You might be pleasantly surprised at the difference it will make in terms of that person's commitment and that person's energy level. So there's 5. So I've given you 10 conversations to look at, and you don't have to do them all, but I think it's a good idea to start, and your homework naturally is going to be around having some of these developmental conversations with your team members, or at least extending it if you're already doing it. Okay, now a couple of key things just to sum up before we finish up and I give you your homework. One of the things I'd like you to think about is that there are 3 positions that you can be in a conversation. And it's important that we consider what those 3 positions are. The first position is exactly that, first position. That's where you're looking at things through your own eyes. So in other words, if you see 2 people in the corridor having an argument, finger pointing, frowns on their faces, leaning forward, hostile, they're probably likely to be categorized as being in first position. In other words, what they're doing is they're looking at the other person through their own eyes. They're defending their turf, committed to their point of view, but not willing to be committed to the other person's point of view. Now, that's obviously not very productive. Second position is where you get to understand the other person's perspective and understand perhaps why they're thinking the way they are, so you can understand that. You might recall we had the question earlier on about how might you end Catherine's question about ending in a conversation, ending in a positive way. Well, probably a good place to go is to actually start to ask them, I'm interested to know, why do you have the view you have? Can you give me some rationale, some reason for it? Now, a third position is even better, because what you're doing there is you're taking an overview, you're taking a peripheral perspective. So not only do I know what my position is, I also know what the other person's position is. And also, on top of that, I can see the big picture. I can understand how this all locks in and relates to the rest of the workplace and what we do. So it's far superior to be in second and third position, and try to get yourself out of first. So that it's obviously, again, easy to talk about than do, but you're not going to achieve much in first position. And the other thing that I'd said earlier on, and I think it bears repeating, is it's really important for you to learn to get good at asking questions, right? Ask questions. Ask people to explain what they mean. Get people to elaborate. Get people talking. A great question you can ask people initially when you're getting to know them, or there's a project they're working on, you need more information, is this: do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions so that I understand exactly what's going on? What a great question. Now, no one's going to say no to that. And if they do, well, it's a very strange interaction. And then once they've given you the green light, aren't you then in a very strong position to ask a series of questions without feeling guilty about playing detective? You can actually ask a bunch of questions because you've actually been given license to do that, because you've asked for it. So yes, it is a closed question. Do you mind if I ask you? But that's what you want, a yes. And once you've got that, then you can start asking questions. Okay, so we've talked about some barriers. We've talked about the 5 conversations framework. We've talked about 5 additional questions conversations. Now your homework. I want you to commit to having a fortnightly catch-up or a monthly catch-up with your team members, and I want you to stick with it, and I want you to make it absolutely, diary bound. And I want you, during each of those conversations, is to have one of those developmental conversations that I went through with you. You will find it will work extremely well, and your confidence will grow. Your trust level will grow with your particular team member. They will feel more positive, and you may well see some increases in performance as a result of it. So I would strongly commend you to have a crack at that, because it works really, really well. All right, we're about done, guys. I did want to make an important announcement next time we meet. Next time we meet in a fortnight, we'll be doing Module 4, Unit 4. I'm going to be away. I'm going to be on a plane at the time that Lunch and Learn takes place. There's nothing I can do about that. But what I'm proposing to do is to move the time into the earlier morning space. So I'll obviously send you an email and I'll let you know that. But I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. Of course, if you can't make it in the morning, that's not a problem in the sense that you'll still get a recording and the slides. But I just wanted to let you know that, because I think sometimes it can be a bit of an issue. Obviously, I can't do this on a plane, and the reality was that that was the only plane at the time, so there was nothing more I could do about that. Anyway, guys, that's it. I wish you well over the next fortnight. Keep your eyes peeled for this afternoon. You'll get an email from me with the recording and a little bit of information about when we do Module 4. So thank you. I've enjoyed working with you again, and I wish you all the best in your conversations, and have a fantastic weekend. Thanks, guys.